Check one. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like it's about time to begin our class period this morning. If y'all would find your favorite seat, we will begin. We will begin class, but we will continue our study in Ecclesiastes. We are looking at chapter 3 this morning, a very interesting chapter. Not that all of Solomon's writings are not. I read somewhere 900 proverbs, I think, he's been given credit to, but in 2 Kings, or well, I guess it would be 1 Kings maybe, it says he wrote over 3,000 proverbs, I think. So I don't know which ones didn't make the cut, but we are obviously talking about the wisest man that ever lived. That's been said time and time again, and I think that alone warrants us looking into his comments and his words, which I personally have not done a lot of until the last year or so. So I'm finding it all very, very interesting. Chapter 3 starts with 28 powerful and concise statements about life in general. I mean, he's looking at life, trying to figure out the worth of life, trying to find value and worth. What's it worth to me? What do I get out of this? We noticed that in the first chapter and all the way up to halfway through chapter 2, God was only mentioned one time, and that was to blame him for the toils of life. Halfway through chapter 2, his attitude changed, or at least his approach to this changed, and now with God in the picture, we see the quality of life with God is not futile, and life is impacted by God's will for sure. Starting with verse 1, there is an appropriate time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. Well, he's going to give us about 28 different events of life, and he says there's a time for everything. Who's in control of time? Who set the world into the spin? Who created the sun and the moon and the stars? That's what time is all about. So Solomon starts out by saying, okay, there's a time for everything because God is in control of this. I find it a little bit ironic or interesting, if nothing else, that says there's a time for every event under heaven. What's been the phrase that he's used up to this point? And he will continue to use it again, but what does he normally say? Okay, a purpose, but under the sun. Everything that's done under the sun, and it's, I don't know if Solomon knew at that point the world was round. That was a little bit before Magellan, but he was a pretty wise guy. Anyway, the sun shines somewhere all the time, no matter where you are. So under the sun is how he approaches things. But now, with God in the picture, in my mind, I feel like under heaven is a broader spectrum than under the sun. I mean, the sun is in heaven, and as we picture God overall, I think by him saying a time for everything under heaven puts it more in God's hands, kind of to me. Everything under heaven, not just under the sun. And he's saying there's a time for everything. Now, this is not just a pessimistic viewpoint. It's a viewpoint of choice. We're free moral agents, so we can choose all of these things that there is a time for. To some extent, we can do what we want to do. However, it's a wise decision to consider God in control of time, and the wise will live optimistically because God is in control of all of these things. Sometimes we're ill-equipped to make decisions, so we should trust God and look at his word to help us with decisions. And are all decisions always a right or wrong decision?
I wonder how we know if the idea was supposed to land under the moon.
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the moon controls the tide, And the tide, the ocean covers, what, 3/5 of the globe? And if the moon controls that, it's got to be important. So I think it may be a good idea to look at the moon every now and then. The man in the moon, anyway. I've just got to stop and say this, and I'm going to run out of time anyway. I was at Ole Miss back in the 70s, and there was a young lady from Chicago, and something came up about the man in the moon. And the man in the moon, the two eyes and the nose you can see, and is that what y'all see? The man in the moon, his face when you see the man in the moon? Huh? Nobody ever looks at the man in the moon. She talked about a man walking with with sticks on his back. And I said, what are you talking about? Yeah, the man in the moon, the guy walking with a load of sticks on his back. Next time you see the full moon, look at the man in the moon and you'll see exactly what she was talking about. Okay, what has that got to do with Solomon? Yeah, all right, let's get right back as soon as we can. There are decisions are not always right and wrong. All right, so we start here in verse 2. The opening of this poem, per se, is 28. I think where I read that they're more like polarities than they are opposites. These things aren't necessarily opposite of one another, but they're at either end of a spectrum, okay? I don't know if the opposite of birth, to be born, would be maybe not to be born. That would be the opposite of it, maybe not death. But Solomon, in his wisdom, starts with a time to give birth and a time to die. Well, if we're talking about human life, is that a good way to open the door here? We're all born and we're all going to die. That pretty much covers the spectrum of life, does it not? I'm not much of a raise your hand guy. That's just me. But I'm going to go ahead and ask this question because I already know the answer. How many people in here had anything to do with the time of their birth? Okay. I knew no one was going to raise their hand. And unfortunately, with the exception of maybe suicide, who really has any control over the time of their death? There's a time for everything. Who is in control of that time? Birth to death. We're talking about the spectrum of life here, and these are things that are not in our control. I like the second part, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. Everything that's alive is either what? Animal kingdom or plant kingdom. Who came up with that? Well, Solomon already addressed right here in verse 2. A time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot what is planted. So we're looking at animal and plant kingdom right here. He's saying, okay, we're going to cover it all. Now, is this guy smart? This is 1,000 years before Christ, okay? I mean, he's thinking through all of this sort of stuff. So, plant is life, to uproot it is death. It's now no longer fruitful. So, verse 3, there's a time to kill and a time to heal. Well, a time to kill. Time to kill human life, time to kill animal life. We have to kill animals. If you're not a vegetarian, there's a time to kill them. In the fall of the years when they used to kill a hog, and there's a time when it's at the right life stage or whatever. There's a time to kill. What about capital punishment under the old law? There was a time to kill. What about in God's plan? Anybody remember a guy named Noah? God killed the whole world except for 8 people. What about Moses and Pharaoh and all of that? Killed all of those firstborns. What about going into the land of Canaan? Okay, there's a time to kill, okay? Even though under the old law, it's not a point of justification. Either way, the preacher's just saying in a world where death, we've already referred to in our first statement, where death is a major focus of things, there's going to be a time to kill. That's going to be part of the cycle. So there is a time to kill and a time to heal. See, that's not exactly the opposite of healing is not the opposite of killing. You know, so we see polarities here more than anything else. Maybe it's mending a relationship instead of ending it permanently in death. A time to kill, a time to heal. Maybe it's not time to die. Maybe it's time to fix things. Maybe it's time to heal. Maybe in a relationship, make peace in a relationship, repair the damage, or maybe it's a time to bring it to an end, because the rest of verse 3 says a time to tear down and a time to build up. Old shed in the back, is it time to tear it down? Well, is it still any good? Does it have any value? Is it worth anything? That's what Solomon's looking for, is worth in everything. So sometimes it's time to leave it there. Sometimes it's time to tear it down. Well, and that's repairing it or giving it new life. That may be referring back to the birth part of this thing. But what about a time to build up? Wow, Solomon. How about Acts 20:32? And now I entrust you to God, to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up. What about Romans 14:19? So then we pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. 1 Corinthians, according to the grace of God which was given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, another is building on it. 2 Corinthians, for these things I'm writing to you while I'm absent, so that when I'm present I need not use severity in accordance with the authority which the Lord gave me for building up and not tearing down. 1 Peter, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for the holy priesthood. I'm laying a stone in Zion, a building up. So we see these concepts that Solomon is laying out way, way early before any of this New Testament stuff is written. You think Paul, studying under Gamaliel, ever read any of this stuff? You think it had any? It's all coming from the Holy Spirit, but it's the same author. The same people that are telling, the same entity, the Spirit that is telling Solomon these things, is the same Spirit that was telling these New Testament writers. And it's the same information. But this is the first time we're hearing this stuff. Big time stuff. Okay, where was I? Verse 4. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. What does Romans chapter 12 tell us? Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Is he not quoting Solomon right here out of Ecclesiastes? Paul, same thing he's saying. Is there a time to mourn? A time to weep? Of course it is. When do we mourn? When we lose a family member or a friend, there's a time that we should be mourning with those people. Is that a time? Do you ever hear a big hee-haw, belly-busting laughing at a funeral? I mean, that's not appropriate. It's not a time for that. It's not the right time. So there's a time for everything. Solomon sees that, and he's laying it out big time. Jesting is not appropriate at a funeral, but to mourn, to share in the tragedy, to share. If you dance, there's a time to dance. You dance by yourself? Well, maybe. Usually that's sharing in celebration with someone. So you share in their mourning, you share in their celebration. So there's a time for all of this stuff when it is appropriate. Solomon, man, oh man. Verse 5, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, all in one verse. Well, we think of throwing stones. What's the first thing that comes to mind? You know, some sort of aggressive behavior if you're throwing stones, but, you know, in the fields, when they were, you know, even New Testament reference, once again, what do you got to do in your field if you're fixing to plant a garden? You need all those stones in there? You need rocks? No. Michael made mention last week of something that lit up with me. We talk about the carpenter's son. We always think about Jesus being a carpenter and a woodworker. I always was happy that he was a woodworker because I kind of do a little bit of that myself. Man, they weren't building wooden houses back then. More than likely, they were all out of stones. So as Michael was saying, there's a good possibility that Jesus was maybe more of a mason, maybe more of a stone guy than a wood guy, which is neither here nor there. But I'm just saying, with this building up and these stone references, maybe there's a time to gather stones to build a house. That's for times of peace and times of warfare. There were readings that I read that the enemy would come and throw stones into the fields, so you couldn't plant, you couldn't harvest, you couldn't plow, you couldn't do what you needed to do because all of these stones have been thrown. So there's a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. Then immediately in that same verse, we have a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. So maybe in this throwing stones, we're talking about relationships, because we immediately go to hugging or not hugging. COVID, was that a time to hug? A lot of people like to. It was like, look, you know, I love you, but maybe now is not the time. Okay? So there is a time to embrace. Then there's a time to, you know, if we got a little issue here, if there are being stones thrown, that was kind of hard to say, stones thrown, maybe I don't want to hug you right now. Maybe we got some things we need to build up and try to get solved. There's a time for embracing. There's a time to shun embracing. Okay? Verse 6, a time to search and a time to give up as lost. Who? More New Testament. We got a lost coin. We got a lost son. What's the other one? We got the lost sheep. So this same concept that Jesus uses in his parables, there's a time to search for things that are lost. I mean, it all goes right back to the wisest man here with the exception of Jesus, but even Jesus himself through the Spirit is referring back to these same concepts that Solomon is laying out for us. There's a time to search, and then what? How many times have it's been like, okay, I'm done looking for it? You know, it's going to show up because probably it's where I put it that I said I'll put it here so I won't forget where I put it, you know. At some point, there's a time to give up as lost. Time to go buy a new one. I think caulking gun is mine. I've got about 7. Every time I need one, I can't find it. And it's like, well, it's only, I'm just going to go get another one, you know. And Amy just shakes her head and says, there's 8 hanging on the thing out there, you know, where you didn't look. Sometimes there's a time to give up what is lost. I also thought about, as I read this, what did Paul and it was probably, was it Silas or Barnabas? What did they do when they finally left? Well, it must have been Barnabas, because I think it was Iconium and up in there. Shook the dust. We're done. We've tried. Not that he wanted them to be lost, because that was the first trip they came back through time and time again. But at some point, isn't it time to give up? Shake the dust off and move on to the next program. Okay. A time to keep and a time to throw away. Did we do that one? Yeah. give up is lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away kind of refers to the same thing we're talking about. If it's lost, you've hunted, you can't find it, maybe just accept it as lost and move on. Verse 7, a time to... Yeah, I don't know if they had hoarders back then or not. They had hiders. I know Achan was, but whether or not they were hoarding things, I don't think they had as much stuff. Maybe Solomon did. He had more stuff than anyone. Okay, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together. What do you think he's referring to there? What do we read all the time in the scriptures when someone is distressed or mourning or angry? Yeah, they rent their clothes. You know, just tear my cloak. There's a time to tear apart. Sometimes when you're mourning, we're already in the same sort of attitude here. Sometimes it's a time to rent your clothes. But then there's also a time to do what? So, relationships, be they business, personal, whatever. Sometimes you tear them apart. Sometimes it's a time to sew them back together. Let's get them back together. Yeah, a time to tear apart, a time to be mourning, and a time not to mourn. My favorite example of that, and I try to utilize it with encouragement with people that are going through physical trials in their family or whatever. What did King David do when that little baby was sick and dying? He mourned. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't sleep. They couldn't get him to do. And as soon as they came in and told him that little baby's gone, what did he do? He got up, took a shower, shaved, give me something to eat, give me that nice new robe I got. And they're going, what? I mean, when he was... So, there's a time to rent your clothes and tear apart. When it's done and over with, it's time to put it back together. Solomon knocking me out here. You know, what a brilliant mind. Okay, a time to be silent and a time to speak. Knows that you're a fool. A time to be quiet and not be a fool, or else go on and open your mouth and let everybody know you're a fool. That's what my brother here says, Brother Ray. I mean, how many New Testament references do we have here? You know, there's a time to speak. I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they will give an account on the day of justice, the day of judgment. That's Jesus speaking. What about one of my favorites, when the Pharisees came up and asked him a question they thought was a tough question? What did Jesus do? He just squatted down and started scribbling on the ground. Was it a time to speak? Not then. Even Jesus, who had an answer because he eventually gave them an answer, but there's a time to speak and there's a time not to speak. What about James 1:19? Quick to hear, slow to speak. I mean, and I just have to stop writing down sometimes New Testament references of the stuff that Solomon has said. There's a time to speak, there's a time to shut up. I need to have that tattooed on my arm, I think, for me anyway. Yeah, 2 ears, 1 mouth. That should, twice as much ability to hear as you do. And the difference between hear and listen is also a long story, okay? The difference between hear and listen. Well, the story of Job, they went a couple of chapters before anybody ever said a word. Maybe they didn't say the right thing when they did, but sometimes it's better just to sit and just be there. Just just know that you're there, you know. Absolutely. So that's what I'm saying. I just have to give up on all the New Testament references that he does, because it's a time to speak and a time to be silent. A time to love and a time to hate. Well, we're kind of going back to this concept of tearing down and building up. A time to love. We should love people like God loves us and love one another. And what should we hate according to 1 John chapter 2? Hate sin, hate sinful practices. So there's a time to love like God and a time to hate sin and hate the devil. See, we're getting to the end of this big long series of things. So now he's beginning to spread his concept even bigger. Time to love like God, time to hate sin and the devil. So as we look at this birth to death and all of these events that come through here, as we get to the end here, he says there's a time for war and a time for peace. Well, he's bringing us to a major conclusion. And I put this down for myself, but I said no pun intended. We're getting to a conclusion, but are we making any conclusions here out of this? Absolutely. War and peace. God called on his people to go to war. Today, sometimes it's necessary. But also looking at the total picture of life, birth to death, dying. What does Timothy say? Oh, not Timothy. What does Paul say to Timothy? We're in a fight. We're fighting against who? Fighting against the prince of the earth. We're fighting against Satan. So there's a time for war that we've got to fight. I fought the good fight. We're here to fight against the devil. All of these references that that Paul has made, we're in a spiritual war against Satan for the gospel. So, in this time of war, what is there also a time for? Time for peace. Now then, look at this grace and Jesus, blessed be who? I mean, even the Beatitudes, you can pick through Solomon's writings and see stuff here. It's just amazing to me how much of this stuff I find. And maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm putting it together and it's not really there. But if there's a time for peace, and Jesus said, blessed be the peacemakers, you tell me, okay? So, the warfare. So look at the whole big picture of this thing now. A time to give birth and a time to die. Beginning to the end. A time for warfare against Satan during all of that time from birth to death. And if we are successful in our journey through this world with the grace of God, what's the last thing that we should end up with? Now, is that cool or not? The way my man has laid this thing out, and he is, I don't think he's just jotting something down on a stone, you know what I mean? He's pretty much thought this thing all the way through and put this section together. Now then, 6 months ago, without Denny Petrio's commentary, I would have just read through that and said, oh yeah, well, time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. Yeah, that makes sense, but how much sense does it make? He's laying out the whole spectrum of life here. And ends with, what profit is there to the worker from that which he toils? What profit, what good is any of this stuff if we don't put the fact that God is in control of time and our destiny? The wise man uses God's plan to his advantage. All of these things we said when we started, there's not always a right decision and a wrong decision. You just make a decision. I heard a TV show one time where a lady said, no decision is worse than the wrong decision. Not making a decision at all sometimes is worse than making the wrong decision. If you make the wrong decision, you can go back and change it. If you don't make a decision at all. Pardon? Yeah, nothing to change if there's been no decision at all. So, don't be stubborn and rebellious and try to do things in our own time. Talked to a lady the other day. She was saying, I'm praying for God to do this and praying for God to do this, and this, it needs to hurry up and it needs to, and I said, yeah, I said, there's one little problem with this approach. God don't wear a watch. He's in control of time. Everything happens in his time. I mean, we see it with Solomon. The divided kingdom is coming. All of that, everything wrong that went wrong with Solomon turned out on a positive note because God loved him and because God's in control. It ended up going through all of the captivities and all of these things. It ended up with the Romans because Paul said it happened at the right time. Jesus came at the right time. He didn't come back during the Babylonian Empire, during the Greeks or whatever. There was stuff to be done on God's time frame. God's in control of time. I have seen the task which God has given the sons of man with which to occupy themselves. Yep, you've pretty much covered it, I think. You've seen the task which God has given the sons of men. What is task? If it's task, what is it? It's work, isn't it? So, does that tell us that God intends for us to work? What did he do during the creation? He worked 6 days in a row doing stuff that we can't even comprehend, that Moses has to describe to us in a way that human mind can possibly fathom it. But I can't understand the creation of a universe. Can y'all? I mean, really? Moses tells us something that we can kind of, okay, well, I get it, but what? There's probably a little bit more to it than a couple of chapters in Genesis. Speaking of that, what about Adam? He was in paradise. What did Adam have to do? He worked. He had to do. He had stuff to do. It's not just God has put us here with tasks, with things to do. We're not supposed to just kick back and cruise through. Not through all of these things that he has just listed. All of. True enough. Yeah, we won't go there. But you got to work to eat. Most of us do. Yes, sir. He did put him to work and put some thistles and thorns and stuff to get in the way too. All sorts of hindrances. Verse 11, he has made everything. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has set eternity in their hearts so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. All is in God's plan, and speaking of vanity and futility, are we going to figure that out? We're going to figure out God's plan of how he does things? Well, the plan of salvation and our plan of hope, yes, but Solomon's saying right here, he's made everything. He has set eternity in our heart, yet that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. We can't understand God. And it's futile for us to try to figure out God. What's God look like? Where does he really live? Where did he come from? If there was God at the beginning. Bingo, okay? There's the answer that mankind came up with, right? There isn't. Bingo. Walking by faith. Abraham, pack up and go. Did Abraham say, well, I need a map, and where am I going? Where do you want me to go to? He asked any of those things? No. So, we see the futility of trying to, the Hebrew word for this is appropriate, for appropriate is beautiful. In an appropriate time is a beautiful time. So, God has made it, it's going to be a beautiful thing, okay? It's appropriate. It's done what it's supposed to do, okay? Set eternity in our heart. Okay, this is kind of big time here. We have eternity set in our heart. Could be seen as a negative. Put eternity in man's heart and left him alone to figure it out, which he can never do. We just said that. You never be able to do it. Well, that would be a negative view of this, but the positive view is a longing to prioritize all of these things that Solomon has told us about in the appropriate time, according to time, according to the beautiful plan of God. Set your life in place with these things in an appropriate time, rather than believe that earthly life is all there is. What God builds up lasts forever. What man builds does not. Which is wisest to seek? All of these things, or to seek God? Which, in the last of the list in verse 8, if we seek him, what do we end up having? Peace. That's the end of the program, okay? All right, starting in verse 12, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. I know. This starts a series of I knows. There's two of them down in verse 14 as well. To rejoice, to do good, to help others. Somebody flip back over to, maybe even on the same page. What about chapter 2, verse 17? What did chapter 2? Now, this is before we put God into the program. What's chapter 2, verse 17 say? This is before God had been put into the formula. I hated life. We got English teachers? What's the tense of that verb? Hated. Past tense. Now, it is positive. A longing to prioritize. It ends with peace. Verse 12, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lifetime. Okay, I said that. Here are three things that we can bring up here in chapter 3, 5, and 9, the points that he will make. Life is good and should be enjoyed. Life is given by God. Life is full of pleasures by God. Is that now completely different from I hated life? Yeah, we see how he's unfolding these things, and once God is in the picture, hating life changes to all of the good. So in verse 13, we see now how much Solomon is referring to God. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. So everything, eating, drinking seems good in his labor. Eating and drinking are signs of a good life, right? If you're eating and drinking, things are good. You got water, you got food, you're alive and well. 1 Timothy 4:4, for everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received in gratitude. You think Paul has ever read any of this stuff here? I mean, he's just almost quoting him all through his epistles. He's leaning on the wisdom of Solomon. Paul was a very wise man. He studied under Gamaliel, who was one of the head teachers of the Pharisees. And what did those guys have to study? This. Pardon? The law and the Psalms and the prophets, and all of this falls into that program. All right, verse 14, we've got the second I know. I know that everything God does will remain forever, and there's nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take away from it, for God has so worked that men should fear him. is it not new? I mean, don't add, don't take away. There's nothing to add to it. There's nothing to, 4 points we see here. God's control is permanent. It will remain forever. In case you're tired of me quoting Paul, how about Peter? All flesh is like grass, all glory is like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls off, but the word of the Lord endures forever. God's word is effective. Genesis 1:31, God saw that all he had made, and behold, what? Every day he came along and he saw that it was good. He saw that it was good. Then when he got to the very end of it, what did he say? It was very good. So do we need any more? If God says that's complete and that's very good, that's good enough for me, okay? Good enough for me. Is it complete? Do we need to add to it? Do we need to take away? All right, so far we've had Jesus, we've had Paul, we've had Peter. Now let's go ahead and throw John in the mix, okay? Revelation 22, 18, 19, the very end of the book, what does it say? The end of the New Testament. Don't add to this. You don't need to take anything away from it. That's the last thing that's said in the Bible, and Solomon's talking about it here 1,100 years before John ever wrote it. So, very wise man. It is also very purposeful. Fear God. Exodus 20:20, that's what the law was written for, is that man would fear God. Matthew 10:28, Jesus talking. Who do we fear? The guy that can kill the body? No, don't fear him. Fear the one who can kill the body and the spirit and the soul. Solomon, right here. Okay, so the whole concept of Ecclesiastes falls right here. If you look at the end of the book, chapter 12, 13, what is his final conclusion? It's a spoiler. I'm jumping ahead. I think y'all have already probably read the whole book, right? What's the last deal after all of this stuff he's trying to figure out? Fear God, keep his commandments. That's the bottom line right there. So we see the whole concept. All right. Oh, I don't know if we're going to finish this chapter. Verse 15, that which has been already and that which has already been, for God seeks what is past. This is a difficult passage. It sounds almost like chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. That what's already happened has happened, what's going to happen is already going to happen. We already know about that. But now God is in the picture with his cycle of life, all of these things. With man alone, all is hopeless. With God, there is security and hope. God seeks what is past. That's the one that the commentators have such a fit over. He seeks what has passed by. With God, there's got to be an account. The Hebrew word here means to pursue keenly, almost to persecute, to just get right down and see what someone is all about. We've got to see who they're made of, what's inside. This word appears only here in Ecclesiastes and also in Lamentations, Jeremiah. Only 2 times this word appears in the Hebrew in the Bible. I feel like it's talking about judgment. I don't know. We're not going to have time to get into it. We're just going to have to finish this next week. If we run long, I'm going to have to beg for another week or two. It says what now? What has been pursued? What have been your activities? What have you done? Back to those 28 things that we kind of listed through. I feel like it's judgment. God seeks what is past. He wants to know what are we going to be judged by? How we have lived, what we have pursued, what we have done. Verse 16 starts with, furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. So we see that this I have seen makes me think that it's talking about judgment, because he's talking about judgment right here. What has he discovered? With mankind, perfect order is not seen. Men pervert justice into wickedness. When an opportunity to be fair, men can turn it into wickedness or advantage to themselves. We see that in, must I say, in politics and the laws of this land. You know, I've often asked the question, why do people want to go into politics? Is it really because they have that much concern for their fellow man and for the city and the county and for the government, and they're just really overwhelmed with helping everybody out, that's what all of this is, spending all this money and all this hoodoo that's on the TV now? What is that all about? What's in it for me? Because that's the big question that Solomon is asking. What good is it? And he said, and I've seen it. I've seen wickedness in both kinds. He even says there in 16, in the place of righteousness there's wicked. What is he talking about? The temple maybe, or where they worship? Can there be evil in worship? They worship me in vain, teaching the precepts of men. I mean, boom, there it keeps on going. New Testament stuff just dripping through Ecclesiastes. Judges, kings, business owners, all are placed in a position to be fair and equitable. You know, business people in a position to make money. That's why we do it. I always like to use the terms. I would tell people that I need to make a living, but I don't need to make a killing. There's a couple Solomon left out. Actually, he didn't, did he? That's right in there too. So, we see a time for these things. It can happen anywhere under the sun. The preacher now introduces this concept now to show injustices are more bearable when one realizes he will be vindicated by God. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man for a time, for every matter, and for every deed there is. So, he's laying it out for us pretty strongly here, okay? Verse 17, the first two of the I said to myself starts right here. A time will come when God will judge. Matthew 13:30, Jesus, what does he say? What about all those, he planted the field and the enemy came and put all the weeds in the wheat. They said, well, do we try to get these weeds out of there? No, don't get the weeds out. You pull up the weeds, you're going to pull up the good stuff. Let them grow together. And when? At the end, what are we going to do? Then we're going to separate them out. Judgment will come at the ultimate harvest. So God seeks what is past. Man may not always see the retribution. It might not always happen when we see it because we're looking for things on our time frame, right? But God will judge the wicked. It's going to happen. Okay, people are coming in the front. I don't know if I try to run through this or not. I kind of want to get into this thing about the animals because I'm a pet lover myself. So anyway, we're just going to have to go ahead and stretch into chapter 3 next week. And when we get to the end, I'll either hurry up or else I'll beg for another week or two in the quarter so we can finish this thing, okay? Thank you all so much for your attention. I know it's a lot of stuff, but I hope you're finding it as interesting.